Alright, that seems to have worked. Yeah, well, I'm broadcasting sound now. Let me just check something else. Alright, cool. Alright, yep, that looks good. Alright, so yeah, now we're still getting sound. Okay, we're still getting sound now. That's still looking good. Alright, cool. So yeah, so to start again, now there's no sound. Now the sound. So, hi everyone, I'm Tim. Tonight we're looking at thrusting with the sabre, or alternatively the cutlass, or a broadsword, or really any sword that is kind of a cut and a thrust sword. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about how we form the guard that we're using tonight, which is the medium guard. So to do that, all I want to do is start by making an L with my feet, preferably on like a line of nails or a floorboard so I've got a visual cue. But we want to create a straight line between the toes of your sword side foot, then the heel of your sword side foot and the heel of your offside foot. Sword side, offside. I don't need to explain that. So from the front it should look like this. And that line is the centre line of the fight. Because as long as I've got good posture, which I personally don't often, I often have quite awful posture, but if I'm doing my posture correctly, with my arm directly extended directly forward, that creates essentially the centre line of the fight. And there's a tendency when you're doing this to think of the centre line like you would say like boxing, where the centre line extends out from the centre of your body. But with sword, because the sword is on one side of your body, the sword is basically the line created by your narrow feet with your sword side arm extended out straight. And that's the line that you want to line up with your opponent. There's actually really good talk on the concept of centre line that's really quite explicitly explained in Christman, which is a German sabre manual from the period, which you can find in the Discord server as well, which is cool. Anyway, so from here to form the guard, first I want to fix my feet. So I've moved my feet so my feet are 2 foot widths apart. And then bend my knees so that I'm in a comfortable kind of squat. I don't want to be too low, I don't want to be fighting from down here. I don't want to be sitting dead upright. I want to be nice and low. And the way I work out if I'm at the right height is I look at myself in, say, a mirror, or if you've got some big windows in your house you can look at night where you can see reflection, or if you're live streaming you can see yourself in the webcam. That is also thing. I'll know that my knees are bent enough if I'm back, my head doesn't bob up and down. Because if my head is bobbing up and down, like say I'm straight, that means that I'm needing to adjust my height or adjust my knees in order to move back and forth. Whereas my knees are nice and bent, and I can just move back and forth with my head relatively level. I mean, a little bit of bobbing is not going to hurt anyone. This is just a test to make sure that your knees are bent enough, you can do a lot of other things well. Then I know that I've squatted down enough. With my sword, what I do is I take my offhand, I make a fist, and I rest it on my hip. With my sword side hand, I bring my arm out to about a little bit wide, more than 90 degrees. 90 degrees roughly. I extend my forearm horizontally, so my forearm should be essentially horizontal. Like it doesn't have to be perfect. I think you notice the axe behind me. I'm not quite parallel to it, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It can be a little off. But mostly horizontal. Should look horizontal if you don't have like the spirit or anything. I extend my sword out, and I have it so that my tip is probably level with my shoulder. The way I like to think of it, and I think a really good test if you form the guard correctly, other than just looking at yourself in the mirror like I am now, or on your live stream that you do every week, if that's the thing you do, is you want to see, if I extend my arm straight like this, would my sword tip hit an opponent standing in front of me without needing to change height? So, say I've got, say I want to stab my opponent in the face, which is a thing that I'm quite, which is a thing that I might want to do. I just extend my arm and stab them. But alternatively, I might also want to chop them in the arm. If they're holding their arm around this height, which most guards in this system are, I want to be able to just chop straight, bang, straight down on the arm of an opponent in the same guard. And so my tip has to be high enough to do that. I don't want a situation where my tip is flat, and I have to lift it up and then come down, because my opponent's going to react to me lifting my tip. And so yeah, that's kind of a good test to see if I've formed a functional in guard. And I think that's kind of the key when I talk about like how things are really approximate. It's not a question of exact angles and getting at like your protractor and your tape measure. It's a question of what is functional. So I want my forearm to be mostly horizontal, so that's behind my shell, so that my opponent can't chop it easily. I want my tip up at about shoulder height, so I can chop my opponent easily. And I think that's probably the more important thing. Okay, so that's a medium guard. I'm just going to quickly check if there's any comments. Nothing since the sound issues, which hopefully I can find a way to remove when the recording goes up. But yeah, cool. So let's start looking first at the basic mechanics of our thrusts. So if I come on guard, I might switch to a stick. I'm just going to go grab one of my simple sticks. And this isn't just to show off the fact that I have armor in my house. I have a really nice sword rack that my wonderful partner designed for me. But also because this will be a bit more visible, make your lives a bit easier. But yeah, so I come on guard, and there are basically two thrusts I'm going to use. Theoretically, you can thrust from any of the sort of the French hand positions. And if you watch one of the lessons from last year on Empire, I talked through all of them. But in CUTlass and sabre, or British CUTlass and sabre at the very least, there are two primary hand positions used to thrust: tierce and cart. I don't necessarily want to thrust straight. I can do that. The problem with doing that is it doesn't create opposition against my opponent's sword necessarily, unless the sword's in a really odd position. Whereas in tierce cart, when I thrust from this position, you notice how when I'm thrusting cart, my hand is in line with the inside of my body, and when I thrust in tierce, my hand is in line with the outside of my body. I'm displacing my opponent's sword, so if they try and counter thrust at me, their sword's going to be guided off, and I'm going to stab them, which is what I want. So, first let's start with the thrust of tierce. So all I do is I turn my hand over to tierce, so I turn my hand over to form this angle. I want to make sure that my tip is lined up with my target. So if I'm thrusting, like let's say for the sake of argument, I'm actually going to thrust low at someone's belly. I want my tip pointing down when I get tierce. I find personally, if you don't have a specific target you're going for to do something, you just want to throw a thrust because you're throwing a thrust. The best target is about halfway between the armpit and the nipple of your opponent, so about here. The reason being is that unless your opponent's sword is really weird and wide, in which case you'd stab them in the arm, you'd stab them in the hand anyway, you're very likely going to intersect your opponent's sword and create opposition when you thrust to there. Yeah, that's way good. So I turn my hand over to tierce. I point my tip at where I'm going to thrust. I need to make sure that my tip is on-line to thrust before I extend, because if I don't, if I try and bring my tip online in flight, there's every chance that I'm not actually going to get my tip online in time, and so I might slap my opponent or accidentally cut them. And then thrust, I extend, I bring my arm out straight, slightly, and then keep my foot out, drive my back foot to lunge forward, and I pull my back foot and come all the way back, retract. So I show that from the other side, just do a tierce thrust, turn my hand to tip, in point on line, extend, kick, lunge, retract. Now, there's some comments on each of those. I know some comments there. I will get back to them just after I finish this lesson though. Or after I finish this section. Alright. So, again, let's actually practice that a few times. So, tierce, extend, kick, lunge, retract. And you notice when I retract, I'm out here, I come back and I don't bring my hand back until the last moment. I want to leave my sword out because if I pull my hand back as I'm coming back, before I'm coming back, I'm kind of giving my opponent an opening or giving them an opportunity to go to the body, whereas if my hand's out, they have to contend with my sword and the only time they can really go for is my arm, which, okay, yeah, they can go for my arm, but I'd rather them go for, this much of me as opposed to, this much of me. Alright, so let's practice that a few times. So I'm just going to call my numbers, and then we're going to try and get it a bit smoother down track. So, tierce, extend, kick, lunge, retract. Tierce, extend, kick, lunge, retract. Tierce, extend, kick, lunge, retract. And also flock. Tierce, extend, kick, lunge, retract. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is just call lunge, and I want you to do the same motions we did, but I want you to try and get them smooth. So just turn, smooth, go, but still in the same order, because extending before you thrust is really important. There's a tendency, especially for people who've done modern Olympic foil, to kind of half extend and kind of move forward a bit, because when you have priority rules, which actually was a thing in the 19th century as well, there's a tendency to go, oh, well, I've got priority to cover me, whereas when you're doing sabre, where in 19th century sabre there was no priority, that's a 20th century thing, and also in early epee there was no priority, which hangs around today. You need to extend to cover yourself with the weapon. Alright, so let's go through in that order. Lunge, 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 and lunge. And you'll notice that even I abbreviate a little bit, where I'll start to do, or one movement will start to bleed into the other. That's okay. You don't have to have a perfect order. You just have to have approximate. You have to have a functional order. And if you're worried that I'm contradicting myself, or before I said you need to have it in order, and now I'm saying I'm not, well, I mean, for one, I'm not. There's a bit of nuance there, but for two, just go about with it, see what works. I mean, yeah, don't take everything I say as the way things must be done. Take everything I say as a suggestion about how you can do it better. Because my goal here is not to kind of enhance my own ego. Okay, well, it's to enhance my own ego, but it's not to be an authority. I just want the arrogance, I don't want the authority. And so yeah, with everything I'm saying, my goal is not to just promote my knowledge or to standardize things the way that I do them. My goal is to tell you things that will hopefully help you. And if you're like, yeah, Tim, sorry, your method doesn't work for me, that's cool. Let me know in the comments. I actually find people who don't fence the way I fence really interesting, because learning how they fence has enhanced the way I fence, but it's also helped me be a better teacher for people who don't like me. Alright, so let's look at the other thrust that we're going to do, which is the cart thrust. So I bring my hand into cart. So to come to cart, I bring my hand in line with the offside of my body. My hand is in this angle. My tip is pointed at its target, which in this case is halfway between the armpit and nipple. I extend, kick, lunge, retract. And you notice on camera, my hand stays in line with my body, with the outside edge of my body as we go. I don't want to do this where I come to the center line and essentially thrust in six rather than cart, because that will open me up to a counter thrust. I want to make sure my opponent can't counter thrust me, because I don't like being counter thrust. I mean, you might, but I don't act. So I'll show you that from the side. So cart, extend, kick, lunge, retract. And just when I retract, when I finish, I come back to my kneeling guard. So it's a little bit. So cart, extend, kick, lunge, retract. 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 Alright, so now I've had a chance to practice that in a sequence. Let's now practice it as a smooth singular motion. So, I'm just going to call lunge, and I want you to throw, and I want you to do that sequence, but try and get it as a single smooth movement. Still in order, obviously, as best you can. Alright, you ready? And lunge. Lunge. Sorry. Lunge. 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 And lunge. Right. Cool. Weird tidbit there, just of like education stuff. You notice that I will often start moving before calling because I'm very kinesthetic. And so for me, it's a movement that I translate into words. Whereas if you notice someone will always reliably calls before moving, it's probably because they're much more auditory, in which case they're translating their thoughts come in sounds, they then translate into movements. So a bit of tidbit. All right. Cool. So comments. So question: do we three pass in what rapierists might call first position from parry in the engaging guard? So if you're in an engaging guard like this, so medium guard, hand goes up, moves to be in line with the sword side of my body, my tip sits about past my body with about this point, about a third down the blade, which is referred to as the point of percussion, sitting in line with my offside. From here, what the question is, do I come to this position, which is the first position, basically prime, and lunge? Answer to that is you can. It is a viable thing to do. There are times when you might do it. It's just in 19th, it is a functional practical thing to do. It's not really in any 19th century sabre sources. The sabre sources that fight from the engaging guard all thrust almost exclusively in tierce. The reason being is if you go from the engaging guard to tierce and then thrust, in the extension process, you're very, very likely to sweep anything up and displace it. Whereas doing this, like coming to first position, does expose you flowably to people who are in sort of the typical 19th century guards. And I have done this as a kind of a sneaky in absence attack, or as a way of launching like a very low attack to someone's hip. But generally when I'm in the engaging guard, I find that thrusting in tierce is much, much better because it picks up what my opponent's doing. In terms of rapierists, rapiers have kind of fallen out of fashion for about for a few hundred years by sort of the 19th century, 400 or 500 years. But they kind of come back as like a really cool retro historical reenactment thing. The one rapier manual we have from the 19th century by Alfred Hutton, who is looking at old rapier manuals and saying, "Oh, this is what they did." I don't think he. I would have to have a look, to be honest. I don't think he mentions it specifically. However, with people who do foil and epee, they certainly do thrust in prime. So they might come up to prime and thrust. But the reason for that is in epee you see a lot more varied hand positions because a lot of others. I've got one. Yes, no, Anthony. They got. I have to double check. I think I've got the names of my things and must mix up. But they're a very, very noted foil master in the 19th century who wrote not necessarily seminal work, but doesn't actually seem to have been that influential in terms of how he explains things, but is, in my opinion, probably one of the best foil works of the 19th century, which makes it more embarrassing I can't remember his name. Basically what he says is foil comes down to foil or thrust, basically any kind of thrusting play. Certainly foil fencing, you can apply it to epic fencing, or thrusting with CUTlass basically comes down to knowing your hand positions and either moving directly between them, disengaging between them, or cutting over between them, or derobing, which is just a half disengage. But yeah, he explains it like that, and that's just a really, really cool way to think about it, because once it means you only really have to learn the hand positions and some basic and some fairly intuitive ways to move between them, and you've got you can very, very quickly develop a very strong sort of foil game from there. Like you can get up and down really, really quickly, whereas the more traditional kind of more French method of learning foil, where you learn all of these separate hand positions and then all of these separate movements and all these separate other things, takes a lot longer to learn. There seems to be a thing in British sword fighting in the 19th century. The goal is to get people up and competitively bouting, like confidently bouting as quick as possible, which I just think is really cool. It's kind of this. I think it's a lot more democratic than requiring a person to learn a whole heap of stuff before learning it. I'll just quickly check further comments. Oh, yes, the last comment from the Old Sword Club was from Jacob as well, which is probably that's a bit weird. Anyway, so now let's actually vary things up a bit. So I'm going to stand front on. I'm going to call either cart or tiers, and I want you to thrust in cartiers. And I'll be miming along as well, but we're just going to call thrust. I'm going to call thrust a bit randomly, just I think that's going to help. Alright, so tiers, cart, tiers, cart, tiers, cart, tiers, cart, and cart, and tiers. Aha, deception. Alright, cool. So I'm just going to quickly check for comments. Alright, and just have a quick sip of tea. And I apologise to anyone who just heard me swallow really, really bad through the microphone. I don't know when that might happen, and it'll probably happen again. Alright, so now let's look at defending against the thrusts, and we do that primarily by parrying. I mean, there are other methods of defense against thrusts. You can beat, if you can get a better position of leverage. There's some thrusts, and you manage to move their tip, point their tip off and ride the tip back down as a beat. You can do that, but that's really hard to demonstrate without actually having a person here, because as much as the hand movement is fairly easy, the leverage and timing of it needs to be felt. And in the period, they actually used to do blindfolded foil lessons so people could learn to feel when they could get away with that stuff. Incidentally, just when I tried one Olympic foil, just as a kind of point of reference, the thing that actually worked for me the best was doing beats so that someone would extend to get priority. They beat their sword and aggressively come at them, and that threw a few people off, up until the point where they realised that if they basically counter thrusted in absence, they'd still get the point, and then it was not so great for me. But yeah, what we're going to do primarily as a defence is parries. And to parry the thrust of tiers, you parry the parry of tiers. So I move my sword so it's on the same angle, so it's crossed, but it guides my opponent's sword away from me, which allows me to, which gives me an opening to come back at them. So to form the parry of tiers, all I do is move my hand to the tiers position, so it's on the sword side of my body to get in this angle, just like the thrust. except my tip is higher, and depending on the length of the weapon, with a short cutlass, your tip's going to be on the center line. With a longer sabre or a single stick, your tips are actually going to be on the other side of your body, so that you're really covering yourself. Your sword is forward at about 45 degrees, so see how it's, it's roughly 45 degrees. Don't put protractors or anything up to the screen, probably not exactly, but you get the idea. The reason being for that is if my sword is flat like this, I've only really got about this much sword as useful parrying surface. So if my opponent's thrust comes up here, they're going to have the leverage to blast through me, basically. Conversely, if my sword is out like this, and my opponent intersects all the way up here, because they're not directly getting force on force, they're going to be guided off, which is really useful. And one thing anyone who's studied Fiore del Libre will notice, in Fiore, the parries are depicted as swords clashing at the midst, not at the forte. And I honestly reckon that that's because they're depicting the point of impact rather than the end point of the parry, rather than just parrying in the midst. So, come out, my sword is 45 degrees out, my tip is high, my tip is about level with my head, so not pointing at my opponent, and that's how I parry a tip. That's how I parry a tierce thrust. So, from the guard, let's just move between the positions of medium guard and tierce guard, or tierce parry, sorry. And just get a few reps of that in. So, tierce, medium guard, tierce parry, 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 and medium guard. So now, unsurprisingly, to parry the thrust of court, you parry with the parry of court. So similar basic idea, I come to basically the hand position of court, this hand position in line with the offside of my body. My tip is either in line with the opposite side of my body or on the center line, depending on the length of my weapon. My tip is high, about level with my head. And that's my cart parry. This will guide a cart thrust off, so it ends up somewhere over here, and then I've got a nice opening to come back at my opponent. So let's practice that a few times. So cart parry, back to guard, 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 cart parry, and back to guard. Right. So for those of you who were with us last year when we started exploring French counterpoint with Ville, he talks about these parries, doesn't necessarily say how extended the arm should be. I've been playing with Ville a bit, and we've actually found that from a retracted gut, an extended gut that's back-weighted, I can move to a retracted parry and be mid-weighted, which means I'm already gaining momentum for my post as I'm parrying, which I just think is very cool. I'm just going to quickly check the questions. So Mick wants to know, with thrust, actually I can be very clever and put that up on screen. With the thrust using sabre, do you try to keep the curve of the sword going the same direction as the thrust, or do you move your hand to make the sword tip up? So if you just give me a second, I'm just going to grab a curvy blade. This is probably easy to show. Of course, my curvy sword is right down the bottom. So, nice curvy sword. When I thrust with a curvy sword, I line up using the tip. So from here, I'm doing a tierce thrust. I'm pointing my tip at my target and lunging, and that's kind of cool because it means that the curve of the sword will actually displace things often quite far. So when I thrust, rather than whatever I'm thrusting coming out and clashing with my shell, what will happen instead is it will slip off and end up sort of over there somewhere. What this means is that I've got a bigger angle to come in on. I can create more of an opening by forming position. The downside is that I don't have as much control over my opponent's swords. If I thrust them or someone thrusts me and my sword slips off, I can do all sorts of funky circular parries and things like that. With this I can actually circle and flip my tip over to beat as well, which gives me a huge opening to come back. Which is I think why thrusting is not necessarily favoured with curvy sword systems, because there comes a point, there's such a greater variety of counters. But just as a basic thing that you can do with a curvy sword, just throw a thrust, it's pretty cool. So you line up, basically your goal is to create a straight line between your thumb and your tip when you're thrusting with a curvy sword. If that makes sense. Thank you, Jacob. Alright. Cool. So now, let's make this a bit more interesting. So we're going to practice the cart and tierce parry a little bit more, and also go into medium guard. So I'm going to call out either cart parry, tierce parry, or medium guard, and I want you to move between them. And that isn't to say that I'm going to, and I'm not going to do it in order where it's like, cart parry, medium guard, tierce parry, medium guard. I'm not going to bounce you through the three. I'm going to call them randomly, because part of what I want you to do is think about how you get from one hand position to another as efficiently as possible. So starting with medium guard, tierce parry, cart parry, tierce parry, medium guard, tierce parry, cart parry, medium guard, cart parry, medium guard, tierce parry, medium guard, cart parry, tierce parry, medium guard, tierce parry, medium guard, tierce parry, medium guard, tierce parry, cart parry, tierce parry, medium guard, cart parry, medium guard, cart parry, tierce parry, medium guard. Right, so hopefully that wasn't too quick for everyone. But yes, that's kind of when you're doing this, thinking about hand positions you're moving between to do stuff. It's a really, really useful way to conceptualize this. And this is how they do it in the periods. They talk about specific instances of a sword fight. And a lot of the art of sword fighting is about learning to navigate between them. And if you look at things like Hutton's Cold Steel, he has pages of drills that are basically moving between set positions. I do a similar thing where, you noticed before, where I'm just like, you're doing it but randomly. The reason I do it randomly is mostly because I just can't remember. I can't remember sequences of moves very well. I'm very bad at that. So I just do it randomly to make up for it. Although, weirdly enough, one thing that's been discovered more recently in sports science is that getting people to drill movements randomly is much, much better for long-term retention. Which is also why I get you to do the moves predictably and then get you to do them randomly, so that you learn it predictably to learn it quickly, and then do it randomly to retain it longer. Alright, so now let's look at what you do after you parry. So, I'm on guard, my opponent throws a tierce thrust at me, I parry tierce, and now I'm going to riposte them, and sure, I can use any of the cut riposte we've looked at in previous lessons, but I want to riposte with a thrust. So all I do is I bring my tip down, so I'm now in a tierce guard. From the side, probably not as obvious. The medium guard is in front, but a tierce guard is basically a medium guard, except my hand is in tierce, my tip is still on the center line, and level with my shoulder. So the difference between a guard and a parry is, in parry, the tip is up, and possibly up past the center line if you've got a sabre or a stick. Whereas with a guard, the tip is on the center line and level with your shoulder, or pointed at the opponent, because that's going to make thrusting a lot easier. So I do my tierce parry, I come to my tierce guard, I extend, lunge, retract. In this case, I'm retracting to medium guard. I can retract to a tierce guard if I want. And yeah, that's how I basically parry riposte. And if you get good at this, this is a beautifully quick riposte that you can do. It's very direct, and you've got a lot of control of your opponent's sword. Alright, so let's practice that. So, tierce parry, tierce guard, extend, lunge, retract. Tierce parry, tierce guard, extend, lunge, retract. T is parry, T is guard, extend, lunge, retract. T is parry, T is guard, extend, lunge, retract. T is parry, T is guard, extend, lunge, retract. Right, so let's now try and get that as a singular smooth movement. I can totally words. So for the medium guard, I'm going to call parry riposte. I want you to do the parry, guard, extend, lunge, retract. Do the whole sequence as a singular smooth movement. So, medium guard and parry riposte. 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 And parry riposte. Alright, cool. So now, I'm just going to quickly check for questions. That looks pretty good so far. And now we're going to look at the same thing on the other side. So the idea is exactly the same with cart thrusts. Parry and cart. I come to the cart guard, so it's line, I take and put it on line. Extend, lunge, retract. To medium guard. So let's practice that in sequence. So, cut parry, cut guard, extend, kick, lunge, retract. Parry, guard, extend, kick, lunge, retract. Parry, guard, extend, kick, lunge, retract. Parry, guard, extend, kick, lunge, retract. Alright, so now I'm going to start calling parry riposte. I want you to do that sequence again, but I want you to try and do it as a singular smooth sequence. So let's have a go at that. So, parry riposte. 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 And parry riposte. Alright, cool. I'm just going to quickly check the questions. Feel free to ask questions all the way through. Yeah, I'm just going to, because I stopped to take a drink anyway, so you might as well. The best advice I ever got about teaching was to always have fluids nearby, because you need to keep your vocal cords lubricated. Alright, so now let's bring the entire lesson together. So I'm going to call out various positions and actions. So a position I might be like cut parry, or tears parry, sorry. Tears parry. I might call out an action where I might be like cut parry riposte. And I want you to do the whole thing in sequence. I've got a question, so I might quickly answer that before you have got that. So I've got a comment, so I'm going to actually put that up on screen. Great for the sorry, I need to read the rest. For the sake of video game mechanics, a la Hellish Court. Yeah, that's a good thought. Just if you have a bunch of buttons, you could actually do that where you just have one set of buttons for actions and another set of buttons for or another set of buttons for hand positions. That can be very, very cool. So yeah, any prospective game designers, hit Jacob up for what could be a very cool sword game. Alright. So, let's start in our medium guard. And I'm going to mind the actions just to make your lives a bit easier as well. But to start off, tierce parry. Can't guard. Keep you on your toes. Medium guard. Tierce parry riposte. Cart parry riposte. Cart thrust. Tierce thrust. Tierce parry riposte. Cart guard. Tierce parry riposte. That's actually quite a good way to feint, is you go to one guard and then you transition to another guard and launch. So that can kind of throw your opponent off with how they think the parry, or they think the attack's going to come. Right. Cart parry. Tierce parry. Medium guard. Cart parry riposte. Tierce thrust. Cart thrust. Cart thrust. Medium guard. You should probably already be in. Tierce guard. Cart parry riposte. Tierce thrust. Tierce thrust. Tierce parry riposte. And cart thrust. Alright. Cool, so that's the lesson for tonight. So just before we go, if there's any questions you want to ask now is the time to ask. Otherwise we are going to be jumping onto the Discord server after this to chat. And I'll put a link up to, I think I've been spamming the Facebook event with links. But yeah, if you, but I'll also post that again, just because I'm not sure if people in, all the people in YouTube land managed to get that. Cool, so yeah, do you have any burning questions that you want to ask now? And if not, yeah, more than welcome to jump on to the Discord server and we can continue sort of chatting there, and I can drink my tea and just talk about all sorts of weird stuff. Cool, and the other thing as well is if you can spare some money, that would be really appreciated. We do have, as much as we're trying to keep all of these lessons free, especially given I know a lot of you are in lockdown, and also the fact that we've just been able to reach people all across the world, which is really, really cool. But we do have some small running costs, so having a bit of money to cover those would be good, and also having a bit of money to start back up when we can actually do in-person lessons again, hopefully in a few months' time, fingers crossed. That would be really, really nice as well. But yeah, otherwise, cool. So yeah, hopefully that's pretty much the lesson. Doesn't look like there's any more questions. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you all on the Discord. Which, just going back to Jacob's comment about Hellish Court and that is a simple game idea. Yeah, one of the things we're hoping to use the Discord for is also games like Hellish Court or Mountain Blade Bannerlord or Mordhau. That do, the sort of the sword sim games, basically. Yeah, cool. You're welcome, Mick. Cool, so, yeah. All right. Cool. Excellent. All right, cool. Okay, so I'm going to end the stream here, and I'll hopefully see you all on the Discord.